Welcome to Sci-Fi Galaxy, your gateway to epic adventures, cosmic mysteries, and thrilling stories from beyond the stars. Subscribe now and join the journey. Let's head towards our today's exiting story. It starts when Zira's four eyes flick between the data pad in her slender hands and the patient lying on the biobed before her. The reports didn't lie. Severe burns covered over 40% of the human's exposed skin, his right arm was shattered in 3 places, and internal scans revealed ruptured organs she couldn't even pronounce. Any other species would already have succumbed to shock. Yet here he was. Awake. Are you sure you're reading that thing right? The human, Captain Elias Moore, asked, his voice rasping but laced with humor. I've been through worse. A couple of weeks, and I'll be back on my feet. Zira's elongated ears twitched in disbelief. She glanced at his chart again, confirming what she already knew. Weeks? This kind of recovery, if it was even possible, should take months. Captain Moore, she said, her tone calm but firm, you have sustained injuries that, by all accounts, should have rendered you comatose. Your body requires rest, not optimism. Elias chuckled, wincing as the movement jostled his injuries. Yeah, well, we humans are full of surprises. You'll see. Zira suppressed a sigh, her pale, lavender-hued skin darkening slightly in embarrassment. She had spent years studying the physiology of countless species across the galaxy. Humans, she had been told during her medical training, were among the most fragile. Their comparatively weak musculature, fragile skeletal structure, and susceptibility to infections made them a marvel of survival through sheer ingenuity rather than biology. Yet this specimen seemed determined to defy every expectation. She tapped on the console embedded in the wall, bringing up his vitals. To her astonishment, his neural activity was stable, his cardiovascular system remarkably resilient, and, most inexplicable of all, his cellular repair rates were off the charts. Zira double-checked the equipment. It had to be malfunctioning. Your body is repairing itself far faster than what is typical for your kind, she admitted, her voice tinged with professional curiosity. This isn't normal, even for a human. Adrenaline, Elias said with a grin. Best stuff in the universe. That and stubbornness. We don't go down easy. Zira's head tilted, her antennae-like protrusions vibrating slightly as she recorded his words. Adrenaline. She had read about the hormone, but no textbook had prepared her for the raw defiance of reality it seemed to represent. Stubbornness isn't a medical explanation. It's a survival trait, he replied, shifting slightly despite her warning glare. And if you're gonna keep fussing over me, Nurse Zira, you'll need to get used to it. She bristled at his informal tone but chose not to correct him. My job is to ensure your survival, Captain. Not to indulge your recklessness. Before Elias could respond, the medical bay doors slid open, revealing Chief Medic Theory, a towering Draken with crimson scales. His yellow eyes scanned the room before focusing on Zira. Status report on the human, he demanded. Remarkable, Zira admitted. His recovery is progressing at an unprecedented rate. I suspect his adrenal system is responsible, but further observation is required. Theory huffed, his forked tongue flicking briefly. Humans. Always full of contradictions. Keep monitoring him. If he destabilizes, I want to know immediately. Zira inclined her head, returning her focus to Elias as Theory departed. The human gave her a lopsided smile. See? Even your boss thinks I'm amazing. Arrogance is not a survival trait either, Zira shot back, though her tone lacked its earlier edge. Elias chuckled again, leaning his head back against the bed with a wince. Maybe not. But it keeps things interesting. As Zira walked away, she couldn't help but glance back at him. His resilience defied every clinical definition of his species. Perhaps humans weren't as fragile as she had been taught. Perhaps, she thought, they were something far more intriguing. For the first time in her career, Zira felt a spark of genuine curiosity, and just a hint of awe. The medical bay buzzed with controlled chaos as the aftermath of the pirate attack rippled through the ship. Zira moved swiftly between patients, her 4 hands skillfully administering care. Despite the workload, her thoughts kept drifting back to Captain Elias Moore. His rapid recovery was a mystery she couldn't ignore. Vitals are stabilizing, she murmured, checking on a Zilithan patient whose physiology was delicate and slow to heal. In stark contrast, Elias was already sitting up in his bed, chatting animatedly with a pair of curious technicians who had stopped by to see him. The contrast was unsettling. "Nurse Zira." A voice snapped her attention to the door. Chief Medic Theory stormed in, his scales glinting under the sterile lights. "Another wave of casualties is inbound. Prepare for triage." Zira nodded and rushed to her station, but her focus lingered on Elias. Against her better judgment, she stopped by his bed. "Captain Moore, you need to remain still. Overexertion will—" "I'm fine," Elias interrupted, his tone light but firm. "I can help. I've got experience with this kind of thing." Zira's antennae twitched in frustration. "You are still recovering from life-threatening injuries. Any strain could lead to systemic collapse." Elias gave her a crooked smile. "Zira, I appreciate your concern, but humans don't just lie down when things get tough. If I can move, I can fight." "Fight," she echoed, incredulous. "You can barely stand." But Elias had already swung his legs over the side of the bed, wincing as he tested his weight. Zira reached out instinctively to steady him, her delicate fingers brushing against his scarred arm. The warmth of his skin was a stark reminder of how fragile he was, or should have been. "You're going to kill yourself," she hissed. "Not today," he replied with a wink. Before she could argue further, the station's alarms blared. A sharp, mechanical voice announced, "Emergency, hostile forces detected on Deck 12. All personnel prepare for lockdown." The room erupted into motion. Medics secured patients, locked down critical equipment, and prepared for the worst. Zira turned to Elias, expecting him to comply with safety protocols, but he was already halfway out the door. "Captain Moore," she called after him. "This is a medical bay, not a battlefield." Elias paused, turning to face her. His expression, though still laced with his usual humor, was resolute. "Sometimes they're the same thing. Don't worry about me, Zira. Worry about keeping everyone else alive." And with that, he was gone. Minutes later, Zira found herself at the triage station, her hands moving on autopilot as she patched wounds and stabilized critical patients. The sounds of distant gunfire and explosions filtered through the walls, each one a grim reminder of the ongoing battle. She couldn't stop thinking about Elias. How could he fight in his condition? How could he want to? Her answer came sooner than expected. The doors hissed open, and a group of injured crew members stumbled in, supported by none other than Elias. His left arm was slung around a Zilithan engineer, and his right hand clutched a plasma rifle. Despite the fresh burn on his shoulder and the blood staining his shirt, he was grinning. "Got a couple of stragglers for you," he said, his voice strained but steady. Zira rushed forward, ignoring the chaos around her. "You're reckless," she snapped, grabbing his arm to guide him to a nearby bed. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to your body?" "I'm keeping people alive," he shot back, his grin fading into something more serious. "That's what matters." Her frustration boiled over. "You think you're invincible, but you're not. Your body is already pushed to its limits. If you keep this up—" "I know my limits," Elias interrupted, his gaze locking onto hers. "And I know when to push past them." Zira stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of frustration and admiration. Humans were a paradox, fragile yet unbreakable. It was infuriating. It was inspiring. "Rest," she said finally, her voice softening. "You've done enough." "Not yet," he replied, his tone weary but resolute. "But I will." As she watched him settle into the bed, exhaustion finally overtaking him, Zira couldn't help but wonder, were humans truly as fragile as she'd been taught? Or was their strength something deeper, something beyond biology? Something unstoppable? For the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. The silence of the medical bay was deceptive, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the occasional groan of a patient. Zira leaned against the console, her four hands dancing across the interface as she reviewed Captain Elias Moore's medical data for the 100th time. Every scan, every test result, every anomaly pointed to the same conclusion: humans defied the rules. She glanced at Elias, who was asleep on his bed. His chest rose and fell steadily, his vital signs well within normal ranges, normal for a species that shouldn't have survived the injuries he'd sustained. It didn't add up. Nothing about humans did. Driven by a mix of frustration and curiosity, Zira tapped into the station's medical database, pulling up everything she could find on human physiology. The articles painted a picture of fragility, thin skin, brittle bones, a cardiovascular system vulnerable to numerous diseases. And yet, there was also evidence of extraordinary resilience. Stories of humans surviving weeks without food, enduring temperatures that would kill most species, and feats of strength under impossible conditions. Adrenaline, she muttered to herself, pulling up an entry on the hormone. The description was clinical, a chemical that triggered the human fight-or-flight response. But the implications were staggering. Adrenaline wasn't just a survival mechanism, it was a catalyst, unlocking reserves of strength and endurance that seemed almost supernatural. "What are you digging up over there?" came a familiar voice. Zira nearly jumped, her antennae twitching. Elias was awake, his head tilted to watch her with that infuriating grin of his. She frowned. "You should be resting." "I've rested enough," he replied, sitting up with a groan. "What's got you so fascinated?" Zira hesitated. She wasn't sure if sharing her findings would lead to understanding or more reckless behavior. But Elias's expression was earnest, and something in her wanted to understand him better. "I've been studying your biology," she admitted. "Humans are perplexing. By all accounts, you should be one of the weakest species in the galaxy. And yet, you endure. You thrive in conditions that would destroy others. How?" Elias chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're not the first to ask that. Honestly, I think it's just how we're wired. Earth isn't exactly a paradise. We've had to fight for every inch, every breath. Maybe that made us stubborn enough to survive." Zira crossed her arms, her lavender skin darkening in thought. "Stubbornness is not a medical explanation." "Maybe not," he admitted, his grin softening. "But it's part of who we are. We adapt. We push through. When things get tough, we find a way." Before Zira could respond, the station's intercom crackled to life. "Attention, all personnel to their stations. Hostile forces have breached Deck 14. Security teams are mobilizing." Elias swung his legs over the side of the bed, already reaching for his boots. Zira moved to stop him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You are not going out there." "I can't just sit here," he said, his tone sharp. "People are in danger." "You've done enough," Zira argued, her voice rising. "Your body cannot sustain another fight." "Then it'll have to," he snapped, his eyes hardening. "Because if I don't fight, who will?" For a moment, they stared at each other, the air between them charged with tension. Finally, Zira sighed, her shoulders slumping. "You are impossible." Elias grinned again. "You're starting to sound like my old drill sergeant." As he moved toward the door, Zira felt a pang of something she couldn't quite define. Fear? Admiration? Perhaps both. "Elias," she called, her voice softer now. "Be careful." He glanced back, his grin fading into something more serious. "Always." Hours later, the medical bay was flooded with injured crew members. Zira worked tirelessly, but her thoughts were elsewhere. When the doors hissed open again, her breath caught. Elias staggered in, his shirt torn and bloodied but his posture steady. He carried a wounded alien soldier over his shoulder, his jaw clenched in determination. "Got another one for you," he said, his voice wearied but steady. Zira rushed to help him, her hands reaching for the injured soldier. As she worked, she glanced at Elias. He should have been on a bed himself, yet here he was, defying every expectation once again. "Humans," she muttered under her breath, her antennae twitching with exasperation. "You truly are a paradox." Elias heard her and chuckled, leaning heavily against the wall. "You're welcome." As she watched him settle onto a nearby bed, Zira realized something profound. Humans weren't just survivors. There was something far more extraordinary, something she was only beginning to understand. Zira stared at the monitor, her lavender-hued fingers tapping restlessly on the console. Elias's vitals were steady, too steady for someone who had been in a skirmish hours earlier. By all rights, his body should be shutting down from exhaustion and injury. Instead, his regenerative processes were accelerating, cellular activity resembling a body in peak condition, not one under extreme stress. She glanced toward his bed. Elias was seated upright, recounting the fight to a small group of crewmates. His arms moved animatedly, ignoring the fresh bandages across his shoulder. Laughter erupted from the group as he mimicked an alien foe's clumsy retreat. Zira's antennae twitched in irritation. How could he be so reckless with his health? As if sensing her gaze, Elias turned and caught her eye. He offered a quick wave, and she sighed, motioning for him to come over. His amused expression told her he already knew he was in trouble. "What's up, Doc?" he quipped as he approached. Zira frowned, folding her arms. "You should be resting, not entertaining the crew with tales of your exploits." Elias shrugged, wincing slightly. "Laughter's good for morale. Besides, I feel fine." "That's precisely what concerns me," Zira replied, her tone sharper than intended. "Your body is defying every known medical principle. I've studied your physiology extensively, and nothing explains this level of recovery. Not without severe long-term consequences." Elias smirked. "You're worried about me. That's sweet." Zira's antennae stiffened in frustration. "This isn't a joke, Captain. If you keep pushing yourself, you could burn out? Collapse? Die?" Elias interrupted, his voice suddenly serious. "Yeah, I know. But that's not how we humans operate, Zira. When the stakes are high, we don't stop to think about the odds. We just do what needs to be done." Zira stared at him, her mind racing. Was it really that simple? Could a species survive on sheer willpower and instinct? It seemed implausible, but Elias was living proof. Her thoughts were interrupted by the station's intercom blaring once again. "Attention, critical systems failure detected in life support module. Engineering teams, report immediately." Elias's expression darkened. "That's not good." Before Zira could object, he was already heading toward the door. She hurried after him, her frustration bubbling over. "Captain Moore, you are not cleared for any physical activity, let alone an emergency repair mission." Elias paused, turning to face her. "Zira, if we lose life support, everyone on this station dies. I can help. I have to help." "And what happens when your body gives out mid-mission?" she countered. "What happens to the rest of us then?" For a moment, Elias said nothing. Then his expression softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. "I trust you, Zira. If I collapse, I know you'll patch me up again. You've done it before." Her antennae drooped slightly. She wanted to argue, to demand that he stay and let others take the risk. But she saw the resolve in his eyes, the same resolve that had carried him through impossible odds time and time again. "Fine," she said finally, her voice low. "But I'm coming with you." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know you were the adventurous type." "I'm not," she replied, already gathering a portable medkit. "But someone needs to keep you alive." The life support module was a maze of conduits and control panels, each one humming with critical systems barely holding together. The room was thick with heat and smoke, the result of an overload in the coolant systems. Elias immediately got to work, his movements precise despite his injuries. Zira hovered nearby, scanning his vitals and muttering curses under her breath every time his heart rate spiked. "You really are impossible," she said, her voice muffled by the breathing mask she donned. "Thanks," Elias replied, not looking up. "Now pass me that tool over there." Zira complied, her frustration tempered by admiration. Even in the face of danger, he remained calm, focused, and, somehow, hopeful. Suddenly, a burst of sparks erupted from a nearby panel. Elias flinched, shielding his face as the console shorted out. Zira rushed to his side, her medkit already open. "I'm fine," he said quickly, brushing off her hands. You are not fine, she snapped, scanning the burn on his forearm. This is precisely why you shouldn't. Zira, look, Elias interrupted, pointing toward the now stabilized system. It's working. We did it. The hum of the life support systems grew steady, the temperature in the room dropping as the cooling systems kicked back online. Relief washed over Zira, though it was quickly replaced by exhaustion. As they made their way back to the medical bay, Zira couldn't help but glance at Elias. His steps were slower now, his body clearly feeling the strain. Yet his expression was one of quiet triumph. You humans, she muttered under her breath. You really are something else. Elias grinned, though his eyes were heavy with fatigue. Told you we're full of surprises. The medical bay hummed with activity as injured crew members streamed in, each bringing a fresh wave of chaos. Zira moved through the room with precision, triaging patients and delegating tasks. Yet her focus was split. She kept glancing at the far bed where Captain Elias Moore lay, his face pale but determined. His vitals had spiked dangerously during the mission, and while the life support systems were operational again, Elias was far from stable. His body was finally showing the toll of his reckless defiance of biology. Captain Moore is declining, Zira reported to Chief Medic Theory, who stood towering beside her. His crimson scales reflected the harsh lights, and his slitted eyes narrowed as he reviewed Elias's chart. He's a fool, Theory growled. A remarkable one, but a fool nonetheless. He should never have been allowed to leave this bay. Zira's antennae twitched. She had heard similar words from others, but none of them truly understood. Foolish or not, he saved the station. We owe him our survival. Theory huffed but said nothing more, moving to assist with another patient. Zira returned to Elias's bedside, her 4 hands working to stabilize his condition. Despite her efforts, his vitals remained erratic, his body trembling under the strain. Zira, he murmured, his voice barely audible. She leaned closer, her antennae angling toward him. You should be resting, Captain. Rest is overrated, he replied with a weak smile. How's the station? Stable, she said. Thanks to you. His smile widened, but the effort seemed to drain him. Zira bit her lip, her frustration mounting. You've pushed yourself too far. Your body can't handle this kind of stress indefinitely. Yeah, but it could handle just enough, he said, his eyes glinting with that familiar spark of defiance. That's all that mattered. Before Zira could respond, the monitors began to beep urgently. His heart rate spiked, his oxygen levels plummeted, and his body convulsed. Zira's hands moved instinctively, stabilizing his airway and administering a dose of a regenerative serum. Stay with me, Elias, she said, her voice firm but tinged with fear. Hours passed in a blur as Zira and her team worked tirelessly to keep Elias alive. Every time his vitals dipped, they found a way to bring him back, but his body was clearly reaching its limits. Zira couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of guilt. Had she enabled his recklessness by allowing him to go on that mission? Adrenaline only gets you so far, she muttered, her fingers trembling as she adjusted his fore. Even humans have limits. But as the hours wore on, something extraordinary began to happen. Elias's vitals, though erratic, showed a slow but steady improvement. His cellular repair rates accelerated beyond anything Zira had ever seen, outpacing even the advanced regenerative technologies used on the station. His heart rate stabilized, his oxygen levels normalized, and his skin began to heal at an almost miraculous rate. Zira stared at the monitors, her lavender skin darkening in shock. It's impossible, she whispered. Not impossible, came a voice behind her. Theory stood observing the monitors, his expression unreadable. Merely human. By the time Elias opened his eyes again, the medical bay had quieted. Zira sat beside him, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She hadn't left his side, unwilling to trust even the station's most advanced systems to handle his recovery. Hey, he said softly, his voice rough but steady. Hey, she replied, relief flooding her tone. How are you feeling? Like I got run over by a starship, he joked, though his smile was genuine. But alive. You shouldn't be, Zira said bluntly. Your body was pushed far beyond its limits. By all accounts, you should be dead. But I'm not, he replied, his eyes locking onto hers. Because humans, we don't give up. Not when it matters. Zira leaned back, her antennae twitching in thought. I don't understand your kind, Elias. Your bodies are fragile, your biology inefficient, yet you endure where others would fail. It's infuriating. Maybe, he said, grinning. But it's also what makes us human. She couldn't argue with that. For all her training, for all the knowledge she had accumulated about alien species across the galaxy, humans were unlike anything she had ever encountered. They were a paradox, both fragile and unbreakable. As Elias drifted back to sleep, Zira found herself smiling for the first time in days. Perhaps there was more to learn from this so-called fragile species than she had ever imagined. And perhaps, just perhaps, they had something to teach the rest of the galaxy as well. For now, though, she was content to watch over her patient, the human who refused to give up, no matter the odds.